St. George of Merry England. In the darksome depths of a thick forest lived Kalyb, the fell enchantress. Terrible were her deeds, and few there were who had the hardihood to sound the brazen trumpet which hung over the iron gate that barred the way to the abode of witchcraft. Terrible were the deeds of Kalyb, but above all things she delighted in carrying off innocent newborn babes, and putting them to death. And this, doubtless, she meant to be the fate of the infant son of the Earl of Coventry, who long years ago was Lord High Steward of England. Certain is that this babe's father being absent, and his mother dying at his birth, the wicked Kalyb, with spells and charms, managed to steal the child from his careless nurses. But the babe was marked from the first for doughty deeds, for on his breast was pictured the living image of a dragon, on his right hand was a blood-red cross, and on his left leg showed the golden garter. And these signs so affected Kalyb, the fell enchantress, that she stayed her hand, and the child growing daily in beauty and stature, he became to her as the apple of her eye. Now when twice 7 years had passed, the boy began to thirst for honorable adventures, though the wicked enchantress wished to keep him as her own. But he, seeking glory, utterly disdained so wicked a creature. Thus she sought to bribe him. And one day, taking him by the hand, she led him to a brazen castle, and showed him 6 brave knights, prisoners therein. Then said she, Lo, these be the 6 champions of Christendom. Thou shalt be the 7th, and thy name shall be St. George of Merry England, if thou wilt stay with me. But he would not. Then she led him into a magnificent stable where stood 7 of the most beautiful steeds ever seen. 6 of these, said she, belong to the 6 champions. The 7th and the best, the swiftest and most powerful in the world, whose name is Bayard, will I bestow on thee, if thou wilt stay with me. But he would not. Then she took him to the armory, and with her own hand buckled on a corselet of pure steel, and laced on a helmet inlaid with gold. Then taking a mighty falchion, she gave it into his hand, and said, This armor which none can pierce, this sword called Ascalon, which will hew and sunder all it touches, are thine. Surely now thou wilt stop with me. But he would not. Then she bribed him with her own magic wand, thus giving him power over all things in that enchanted land, saying, Surely now thou wilt remain here. But he, taking the wand, struck it with a mighty rock that stood by, and lo, it opened, and laid in view a wide cave garnished by the bodies of a vast number of innocent newborn infants, whom the wicked enchantress had murdered. Thus, using her power, he bade the sorceress lead the way into the place of horror, and when she had entered, he raised the magic wand yet again, and smote the rock, and lo, it closed forever, and the sorceress was left to bellow forth her lamentable complaints to senseless stones. Thus was St. George freed from the enchanted land, and taking with him the 6 other champions of Christendom on their steeds, he mounted Bayard and rode to the city of Coventry. Here for 9 months they abode, exercising themselves in all feats of arms. So when spring returned they set forth, as knights errant, to seek for foreign adventure. And for 30 days and 30 nights they rode on, until at the beginning of a new month they came to a great wide plain. Now in the center of this plain, where 7 several ways met, there stood a great brazen pillar. And here with high heart and courage they bade each other farewell, and each took a separate road. Hence St. George, on his charger Bayard, rode till he reached the seashore, where lay a good ship bound for the land of Egypt. Taking passage in her, after long journeying, he arrived in that land when the silent wings of night were outspread, and darkness brooded on all things. Here, coming to a poor hermitage, he begged a night's lodging, on which the hermit replied, Sir Knight of Merry England, for I see your arms graven on thy breastplate. Thou hast come hither in an ill time, when those alive are scarcely able to bury the dead, by reason of the cruel destruction waged by a terrible dragon, who ranges up and down the country by day and by night. If he have not an innocent maiden to devour each day, he sends a mortal plague amongst the people. And this has not ceased for 24 years, so that there is left throughout the land but one maiden, the beautiful Sabia, daughter to the king. And tomorrow must she die, unless some brave knight will slay the monster. To such will the king give his daughter in marriage, and the crown of Egypt in due time. For crowns I care not, said St. George boldly, but the beauteous maiden shall not die. I will slay the monster. So rising at dawn of day, he buckled on his armor, laced his helmet, and with the falchion Ascalon in his hand, bestrode Bayard, and rode into the valley of the dragon. And on the way he met a procession of old women weeping and wailing, and in their midst the most beauteous damsel he had ever seen. Moved by compassion he dismounted, and bowing low before the lady entreated her to return to her father's palace, since he was about to kill the dreaded dragon. Whereupon the beautiful Sabia, thanking him with smiles and tears, did as he requested, and he, remounting, rode on his emprise. Now, no sooner did the dragon catch sight of the brave knight than its leathern throat sent out a sound more terrible than thunder, and weltering from its hideous din, it spread its burning wings and prepared to assail its foe. Its size and appearance might well have made the stoutest heart tremble. From shoulder to tail ran full 40 feet. Its body was covered with silver scales. Its belly was as gold, and through its flaming wings the blood ran thick and red. So fierce was its onset that at the very first encounter the knight was nigh felled to the ground. But recovering himself, he gave the dragon such a thrust with his spear that the latter shivered to 1,000 pieces, whereupon the furious monster smote him so violently with its tail that both horse and rider were overthrown. Now by great good chance St. George was flung under the shade of a flowering orange tree, whose fragrance hath this virtue in it, that no poisonous beast dare come within the compass of its branches. So there the valiant knight had time to recover his senses, until with eager courage he rose, and rushing to the combat, smote the burning dragon on its burnished belly with his trusted sword Ascalon, and thereinafter spouted out such black venom as, falling on the armor of the knight, burst it in twain. And ill might it have fared with St. George of Merry England, but for the orange tree, which once again gave him shelter under its branches, where, seeing the issue of the fight was in the hands of the Most High, he knelt and prayed that such strength of body should be given him as would enable him to prevail. Then with a bold and courageous heart he advanced again, and smote the fiery dragon under one of his flaming wings, so that the weapon pierced the heart, and all the grass around turned crimson with the blood that flowed from the dying monster. So St. George of England cut off the dreadful head, and hanging it on a truncheon made of the spear which at the beginning of the combat had shivered against the beast's scaly back, he mounted his steed Bayard, and proceeded to the palace of the king. Now the king's name was Ptolemy, and when he saw that the dreaded dragon was indeed slain, he gave orders for the city to be decorated. And he sent a golden chariot with wheels of ebony and cushions of silk to bring St. George to the palace, and commanded 100 nobles dressed in crimson velvet, and mounted on milk-white steeds richly caparisoned, to escort him thither with all honor, while musicians walked before and after, filling the air with sweetest sounds. Now the beautiful Sabia herself washed and dressed the weary knight's wounds, and gave him in sign of betrothal a diamond ring of purest water. Then after he had been invested by the king with the golden spurs of knighthood, and had been magnificently feasted, he retired to rest his weariness, while the beautiful Sabia from her balcony lulled him to sleep with her golden lute. So all seemed happiness, but alas, dark misfortune was at hand. Almador, the Black King of Morocco, who had long wooed the Princess Sabia in vain, without having the courage to defend her, seeing that the maiden had given her whole heart to her champion, resolved to compass his destruction. So going to King Ptolemy, he told him, what was perchance true, namely that the beauteous Sabia had promised St. George to become Christian and follow him to England. Now the thought of this so enraged the king that, forgetting his debt of honor, he determined on an act of basest treachery. Telling St. George that his love and loyalty needed further trial, he entrusted him with a message to the king of Persia, and forbade him either to take with him his horse Bayard, or the sword Ascalon, nor would he even allow him to say farewell to his beloved Sabia. St. George then set forth sorrowfully, and surmounting many dangers, reached the court of the king of Persia in safety. But what was his anger to find that the secret missive he bore contained nothing but an earnest request to put the bearer of it to death. But he was helpless, and when sentence had been passed upon him, he was thrown into a loathly dungeon, clothed in base and servile weeds, and his arms strongly fettered up to iron bolts, while the roars of the 2 hungry lions, who were to devour him ere long, deafened his ears. Now his rage and fury at this black treachery was such that it gave him strength, and with mighty effort he drew the staples that held his fetters. So being part free, he tore his long locks of amber-colored hair from his head, and wound them round his arms instead of gauntlets. So prepared, he rushed on the lions when they were let loose upon him, and thrusting his arms down their throats, choked them, and thereinafter, tearing out their very hearts, held them up in triumph to the jailers who stood by trembling with fear. After this, the king of Persia gave up the hopes of putting St. George to death, and doubling the bars of the dungeon, left him to languish therein. And there the unhappy knight remained for 7 long years, his thoughts full of his lost princess, his only companions rats and mice and creeping worms, his only food and drink bread made of the coarsest bran and dirty water. At last one day, in a dark corner of his dungeon, he found one of the iron staples he had drawn in his rage and fury. It was half consumed with rust, yet it was sufficient in his hands to open a passage through the walls of his cell into the king's garden. It was the time of night when all things are silent, but St. George, listening, heard the voices of the grooms in the stables, which entering, he found 2 grooms furnishing forth a horse against some business. Whereupon, taking the staple with which he had redeemed himself from his prison, he slew the grooms, and mounting the palfrey rode boldly to the city gates, where he told the watchman at the bronze tower that St. George having escaped from the dungeon, he was in hot pursuit of him. Whereupon the gates were thrown open, and St. George, clapping spurs to his horse, found himself safe from pursuit before the first red beams of the sun shot up into the sky. Now ere long, being most famished with hunger, he saw a tower set on a high cliff, and riding thitherward determined to ask for food. But as he neared the castle, he saw a beauteous damsel in a blue and gold robe, seated disconsolate at a window. Whereupon, dismounting, he called aloud to her, "Lady, if thou hast sorrow of thine own, succor one also in distress, and give me, a Christian knight, now almost famished, 1 meal's meat." Which she replied quickly, "Sir knight, fly quickly an thou canst, for my lord is a mighty giant, a follower of Mahomet, who has sworn to destroy all Christians." Hearing this, St. George laughed loud and long. "Go tell him then, fair dame," he cried, "that a Christian knight waits at his door, and will either satisfy his wants within his castle, or slay the owner thereof." Now the giant no sooner heard this valiant challenge, that he rushed forth to the combat, armed with the hugest crowbar of iron. He was a monstrous giant, deformed, with a huge head, bristled like any boar's, with hot glaring eyes, and a mouth equaling a tiger's. At first sight of him, St. George gave himself up for lost, not so much for fear, but for hunger and faintness of body. Still commending himself to the Most High, he also rushed to the combat with such poor arms as he had, and with many a regret for the loss of his magic sword Ascalon. So they fought till noon, when just as the champion's strength was nigh finished, the giant stumbled on the root of a tree, and St. George, taking his chance, ran him through the midrib, so that he gasped and died. After which St. George entered the tower, whereat the beautiful lady, freed from her terrible lord, set before him all manner of delicacies and pure wine, with which he sufficed his hunger, rested his weary body, and refreshed his horse. So leaving the tower in the hands of the grateful lady, he went on his way, coming ere long to the enchanted garden of the necromancer Ormadine, where embedded in the living rock he saw a magic sword, the like of which for beauty he had never seen, the belt being beset with jaspers and sapphire stones, while the pommel was a globe of the purest silver, chased in gold, with these verses: "My magic will remain most firmly bound, till that a knight from the far north be found, to pull this sword from out its bed of stone. Lo, when he comes, wise Ormadine must fall. Farewell my magic power, my spell, my all." Seeing this, St. George put his hand to the hilt, thinking to essay pulling it out by strength. But lo, he drew it out with as much ease as though it had been hung by a thread of untwisted silk. And immediately every door in the enchanted garden flew open, and the magician Ormadine appeared, his hair standing on end, and he, after kissing the hand of the champion, led him to a cave where a young man wrapped in a sheet of gold lay sleeping, lulled by the songs of 4 beautiful maidens. "The knight whom thou seest here," said the necromancer in a hollow voice, "is none other than thy brother in arms, the Christian champion St. David of Wales. He also attempted to draw my sword, but failed. Him hast thou delivered from my enchantments, since they come to an end." Now as he spoke came such a rattling of the skies, such a lumbering of the earth as never was, and in the twinkling of an eye the enchanted garden and all in it vanished from view, leaving the champion of Wales, roused from his 7 years' sleep, giving thanks to St. George, who greeted his ancient comrade heartily. After this, St. George of Merry England traveled far and traveled fast, with many adventures by the way, to Egypt, where he had left his beloved Princess Sabia. But learning to his great grief and horror, from the same hermit he had met on first landing, that despite her denials, her father, King Ptolemy, had consented to Almidor the Black King of Morocco carrying her off as one of his many wives, he turned his steps towards Tripoli, the capital of Morocco, for he was determined at all costs to gain a sight of the dear princess from whom he had been so cruelly rent. To this end he borrowed an old cloak of the hermit, and disguised as a beggar, gained admittance to the gate of the women's palace, where were greeted together on their knees many others, poor, frail, and firm. And when he asked them wherefore they knelt, they answered, "Because good Queen Sabia succours us that we may pray for the safety of St. George of England, to whom she gave her heart." Now when St. George heard this, his own heart was like to break for very joy, and he could scarce keep on his knees when, lovely as ever, but with her face pale and sad and wan from long distress, the Princess Sabia appeared clothed in deep mourning. In silence she handed an alms to each beggar in turn, but when she came to St. George, she started and laid her hand on her heart. Then she said softly, "Rise up, Sir Beggar. Thou art too like one who rescued me from death, for to be meet for thee to kneel before me." Then St. George, rising and bowing low, said quietly, "Peerless lady, lo, I am that very knight to whom thou didst condescend to give this." And with this he slipped the diamond ring she had given him on her finger. But she looked not at it, but at him, with love in her eyes. Then he told her of her father's base treachery and Almidor's part in it, so that her anger grew hot, and she said, "Waste no more time and talk. I remain no longer in this detested place. Ere Almidor returns from hunting, we shall have escaped." So she led St. George to the armory, where he found his trusty sword Ascalon, and to the stable where a swift steed Bayard stood ready caparisoned. Then when her brave knight had mounted, and she, putting her foot on his, had leapt like a bird behind him, St. George touched the proud beast lightly with his spurs, and like an arrow from a bow, Bayard carried them together over city and plain, through woods and forests, across rivers and mountains and valleys, until they reached the land of Greece. And here they found the whole country in festivity over the marriage of the king. Now amongst other entertainments was a grand tournament, the news of which had spread through the world, and to it had come all the other 6 champions of Christendom. So St. George arriving made the 7th, and many of the champions had with them the fair lady they had rescued. St. Denis of France brought the beautiful Eglantine, St. James of Spain sweet Celestine, while noble Rosalind accompanied St. Anthony of Italy. St. David of Wales, after a 7 years' sleep, came full of eager desire for adventure. St. Patrick of Ireland, ever courteous, brought all the 6 swan princesses, who in gratitude had been seeking their deliverer St. Andrew of Scotland, since he, leaving all worldly things, had chosen to fight for the faith. So all these brave knights and fair ladies joined in the joyful jousting, and each of the 7 champions was in turn chief challenger for a day. Now in the midst of all the merriment appeared 100 heralds from 100 different parts of the Paynim world, declaring war to the death against all Christians. Whereupon the 7 champions agreed that each should return to his native land, to place his dearest lady in safety, and gather together an army, and that 6 months later they should meet, and joining as one legion, go forth to fight for Christendom. And this was done. So having chosen St. George as chief general, they marched on Tripoli with the cry, "For Christendom we fight, for Christendom we die." Here the wicked Almidor fell in single combat with St. George, to the great delight of his subjects, who begged the champion to be king in his stead. To this he consented, and after he was crowned, the Christian host went on towards Egypt, where King Ptolemy, in despair of vanquishing such stalwart knights, threw himself down from the battlements of the palace and was killed. Whereupon, in recognition of the chivalry and courtesy of the Christian champions, the nobles offered the crown to one of their number, and they with acclaim chose St. George of Merry England. Thence the Christian host journeyed to Persia, where a fearsome battle raged for 7 days, during which 200,000 pagans were slain, besides many who were drowned in attempting to escape. Thus they were compelled to yield, the emperor himself happening into the hands of St. George, and 6 other viceroys into the hands of the 6 other champions. And these were most mercifully and honorably entreated, after they had promised to govern Persia after Christian rules. Now the emperor, having a heart fraught with despite and tyranny, conspired against them, and engaged a wicked wizard named Osmond to so beguile 6 of the champions that they gave up fighting, and lived an easy slothful life. But St. George would not be beguiled, neither would he consent to the enchantment of his brothers, and he so roused them that they neither sheathed their swords, nor unlocked their armor, till the wicked emperor and his viceroys were thrown into that very dungeon in which St. George had languished for 7 long years. Whereupon St. George took upon himself the government of Persia, and gave the 6 other champions the 6 vice-royalties. So attired in a beautiful green robe, richly embroidered, over which was flung a scarlet mantle, bordered with white fur and decorated with ornaments of pure gold, he took his seat on the throne, which was supported by elephants of translucent alabaster. And the heralds at arms, amid the shouting of the people, cried, "Long live St. George of Merry England, Emperor of Morocco, King of Egypt, and Sultan of Persia." And after he had established good and just laws to such effect that innumerable companies of pagans flocked to become Christians, St. George, leaving the government in the hands of his trusted counselors, took truce with the world and returned to England, where at Coventry he lived for many years with the Egyptian Princess Sabia, who bore him 3 stalwart sons. So here endeth the tale of St. George of Merry England, first and greatest of the 7 champions. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of English Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. English Fairy Tales by Flora Annie Steele. The Story of the 3 Bears. Once upon a time there were 3 bears, who lived together in a house of their own in a wood. One of them was a little wee bear, and one was a middle-sized bear, and the other was a great big bear. They had each a bowl for their porridge, a little bowl for the little wee bear, and a middle-sized bowl for the middle-sized bear, and a great bowl for the great big bear. And they had each a chair to sit in, a little chair for the little wee bear, and a middle-sized chair for the middle-sized bear, and a great chair for the great big bear. And they had each a bed to sleep in, a little bed for the little wee bear, and a middle-sized bed for the middle-sized bear, and a great bed for the great big bear. One day, after they had made the porridge for their breakfast, and poured it into their porridge bowls, they walked out into the wood while the porridge was cooling, that they might not burn their mouths by beginning too soon, for they were polite, well-brought-up bears. And while they were away, a little girl called Goldilocks, who lived at the other side of the wood, and had been sent on an errand by her mother, passed by the house and looked in at the window. And then she peeped in at the keyhole, for she was not at all a well-brought-up little girl. Then, seeing nobody in the house, she lifted the latch. The door was not fastened, because the bears were good bears, who did nobody any harm, and never suspected that anybody would harm them. So Goldilocks opened the door and went in, and well pleased was she when she saw the porridge on the table. If she had been a well-brought-up little girl, she would have waited till the bears came home, and then, perhaps, they would have asked her to breakfast, for they were good bears, a little rough or so, as the manner of bears is, but for all that very good-natured and hospitable. But she was an impudent, rude little girl, and so she set about helping herself. First she tasted the porridge of the great big bear, and that was too hot for her. Next she tasted the porridge of the middle-sized bear, but that was too cold for her. And then she went to the porridge of the little wee bear, and tasted it, and that was neither too hot nor too cold, but just right, and she liked it so well that she ate it all up, every bit. Then Goldilocks, who was tired, for she had been catching butterflies instead of running on her errand, sat down in the chair of the great big bear, but that was too hard for her. And then she sat down in the chair of the middle-sized bear, and that was too soft for her. But when she sat down in the chair of the little wee bear, that was neither too hard nor too soft, but just right. So she seated herself in it, and there she sat till the bottom of the chair came out, and down she came, plump upon the ground. And that made her very cross, for she was a bad-tempered little girl. Now, being determined to rest, Goldilocks went upstairs into the bedchamber in which the three bears slept. And first she lay down upon the bed of the great big bear, but that was too high at the head for her. And next she lay down upon the bed of the middle-sized bear, and that was too high at the foot for her. And then she lay down upon the bed of the little wee bear, and that was neither too high at the head nor at the foot, but just right. So she covered herself up comfortably, and lay there till she fell fast asleep. By this time the three bears thought their porridge would be cool enough for them to eat it properly, so they came home to breakfast. Now careless Goldilocks had left the spoon of the great big bear standing in his porridge. "Somebody has been at my porridge," said the great big bear in his great, rough, gruff voice. Then the middle-sized bear looked at his porridge and saw the spoon was standing in it too. "Somebody has been at my porridge," said the middle-sized bear in his middle-sized voice. Then the little wee bear looked at his, and there was the spoon in the porridge bowl, but the porridge was all gone. "Somebody has been at my porridge and has eaten it all up," said the little wee bear in his little wee voice. Upon this the three bears, seeing that someone had entered their house and eaten up the little wee bear's breakfast, began to look about them. Now the careless Goldilocks had not put the hard cushion straight when she rose from the chair of the great big bear. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair," said the great big bear in his great, rough, gruff voice. And the careless Goldilocks had squatted down the soft cushion of the middle-sized bear. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair," said the middle-sized bear in his middle-sized voice. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair and has sat the bottom through," said the little wee bear in his little wee voice. Then the three bears thought they had better make further search in case it was a burglar. So they went upstairs into their bedchamber. Now Goldilocks had pulled the pillow of the great bear out of its place. "Somebody has been lying in my bed," said the great big bear in his great, rough, gruff voice. And Goldilocks had pulled the bolster of the middle-sized bear out of its place. "Somebody has been lying in my bed," said the middle-sized bear in his middle-sized voice. But when the little wee bear came to look at his bed, there was the bolster in its place, and the pillow was in its place upon the bolster, and upon the pillow there was Goldilocks' yellow head, which was not in its place, for she had no business there. "Somebody has been lying in my bed, and here she is still," said the little wee bear in his little wee voice. Now Goldilocks had heard in her sleep the great, rough, gruff voice of the great big bear, but she was so fast asleep that it was no more to her than the roaring of wind or the rumbling of thunder, and she had heard the middle-sized voice of the middle-sized bear, but it was only as if she had heard someone speaking in a dream. But when she heard the little wee voice of the little wee bear, it was so sharp and so shrill that it wakened her at once. Up she started, and when she saw the three bears on one side of the bed, she tumbled herself out at the other and ran to the window. Now the window was open, because the bears, like good tidy bears as they were, always opened their bedchamber window when they got up in the morning. So naughty, frightened little Goldilocks jumped, and whether she broke her neck in the fall, or ran into the wood and was lost there, or found her way out of the wood and got whipped for being a bad girl and playing truant, no one can say. But the three bears never saw anything more of her. End of chapter 2. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 3 of English Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy McCracken. English Fairy Tales by Flora Annie Steele. Tom Tit-Tot. Once upon a time there was a woman, and she baked 5 pies. But when they came out of the oven, they were overbaked, and the crust was far too hard to eat. So she said to her daughter, "Daughter," says she, "put them pies onto the shelf and leave them there a while. Surely they'll come again in time." By that, you know, she meant that they would become softer. But her daughter said to herself, "If Mother says the pies will come again, why shouldn't I eat these now?" So, having good young teeth, she set to work and ate the lot, first and last. Now when supper time came, the woman said to her daughter, "Go you and get one of the pies. They are sure to have come again by now." Then the girl went and looked, but of course there was nothing but the empty dishes. So back she came and said, "No, Mother, they ain't come again." "Not one of them?" asked the mother, taken aback like. "Not one of them," says the daughter, quite confident. "Well," says the mother, "come again or not come again, I will have one of them pies for my supper." "But you can't," says the daughter. "How can you if they ain't come? And they ain't, as sure as sure." "But I can," says the mother, getting angry. "Go you at once, child, and bring me the best on them. My teeth must just tackle it." "Best or worst is all one," answered the daughter quite sulky, "for I've ate the lot, so you can't have one till it comes again. So there." Well, the mother she bounced up to see, but half an eye told her there was nothing save the empty dishes. So she was dished up herself and done for. So, having no supper, she sate her down on the doorstep, and bringing out her distaff began to spin. And as she span, she sang, "My daughter had ate 5 pies today, my daughter had ate 5 pies today, my daughter had ate 5 pies today." For you see, she was quite flabbergasted and fair astonished. Now the king of that country happened to be coming down the street, and he heard the song going on and on, but could not quite make out the words. So he stopped his horse and asked, "What is that you are singing, my good woman?" Now the mother, though horrified at her daughter's appetite, did not want other folk, leastwise the king, to know about it. So she sang instead, "My daughter has spun 5 skeins today, my daughter has spun 5 skeins today, my daughter has spun 5 skeins today." "5 skeins!" cried the king. "By my garter and my crown, I never heard tell of anyone who could do that. Look you here, I have been searching for a maiden to wife, and your daughter who can spin 5 skeins a day is the very one for me. Only mind you, though for 11 months of the year she shall be queen indeed, and have all she likes to eat, all the gowns she likes to get, all the company she likes to keep, and everything her heart desires, in the 12th month she must set to work and spin 5 skeins a day, and if she does not, she must die. Come, is it a bargain?" So the mother agreed. She thought what a good marriage it was for her daughter. And as for the 5 skeins, time enough to bother about them when the year came round. There was many a slip between cup and lip, and likely as not the king would have forgotten all about it by then. Anyhow, her daughter would be queen for 11 months. So they were married, and for 11 months the bride was happy as happy could be. She had everything she liked to eat, and all the gowns she liked to get, all the company she cared to keep, and everything her heart desired. And her husband the king was kind as kind could be. But in the 10th month she began to think of those 5 skeins and wonder if the king remembered. And in the 11th month she began to dream about them as well. But ne'er a word did the king her husband say about them, so she hoped he had forgotten. But on the very last day of the 11th month, the king, her husband, led her into a room she had never set eyes on before. It had one window, and there was nothing in it but a stool and a spinning wheel. "Now, my dear," he said, quite kind-like, "you will be shut in here tomorrow morning with some victuals and some flax, and if by evening you have not spun 5 skeins, your head will come off." Well, she was fair frightened, for she had always been such a gatless, thoughtless girl that she had never learnt to spin at all. So what she was to do on the morrow she could not tell, for see you, she had no one to help her, for of course, now she was queen, her mother didn't live nigh her, so she just locked the door of her room, sate down on a stool, and cried and cried and cried, until her pretty eyes were all red. Now as she sate sobbing and crying, she heard a queer little noise at the bottom of the door. At first she thought it was a mouse, then she thought it must be something knocking. So she upped and opened the door, and what did she see? Why, a small little black thing with a long tail that whisked round and round ever so fast. "What are you crying for?" said that thing, making a bow and twirling its tail so fast that she could scarcely see it. "What's that to you?" said she, shrinking a bit, for that thing was very queer-like. "Don't look at my tail if you're frightened," says that, smirking. "Look at my toes. Ain't they beautiful?" And sure enough, that had on buckled shoes with high heels and big bows, ever so smart. So she kind of forgot about the tail and wasn't so frightened. And when that asked her again why she was crying, she upped and said, "It won't do no good if I do." "You don't know that," says that, twirling its tail faster and faster and sticking out its toes. "Come, tell me, there's a good girl." "Well," says she, "it can't do any harm if it doesn't do good." So she dried her pretty eyes and told that all about the pies and the skeins and everything from first to last. And then that little black thing nearly burst with laughing. "If that is all, it's easily mended," it says. "I'll come to your window every morning, take the flax, and bring it back spun into 5 skeins at night. Come, shall it be a bargain?" Now she, for all she was so gatless and thoughtless, said cautious-like, "But what is your pay?" Then that twirled its tail so fast you couldn't see it, and stuck out its beautiful toes and smirked and looked out of the corner of its eyes. "I will give you 3 guesses every night to guess my name, and if you haven't guessed it before the month is up, why—" And that twirled its tail faster and stuck its toes further and smirked and sniggered more than ever. "You shall be mine, my beauty." 3 guesses every night for a whole month. She felt sure she would be able for so much, and there was no other way out of the business, so she just said, "Yes, I agree." And lo, how that twirled its tail and bowed and smirked and stuck out its beautiful toes. Well, the very next day her husband led her to the strange room again, and there was the day's food and a spinning wheel and a great bundle of flax. "There you are, my dear," says he, as polite, "and remember, if there are not 5 whole skeins tonight, I fear your head will come off." At that she began to tremble, and after he had gone away and locked the door, she was thinking of a good cry when she heard a queer knocking at the window. She upped at once and opened it, and sure enough, there was the small little black thing sitting on the window ledge, dangling its beautiful toes and twirling its tail so that you could scarcely see it. "Good morning, my beauty," says that. "Come, hand over the flax, sharp, there's a good girl." So she gave that the flax and shut the window, and you may be sure ate her victuals, for as you know she had a good appetite, and the king her husband had promised to give her everything she liked to eat. So she ate to her heart's content, and when evening came and she heard that queer knocking at the window again, she upped and oped it, and there was the small little black thing with 5 spun skeins on his arm. And it twirled its tail faster than ever, and stuck out its beautiful toes, and bowed and smirked and gave her the 5 skeins. Then that said, "And now, my beauty, what is that's name?" And she answered quite easy-like, "That is Bill." "No, it ain't," says that, and twirled its tail. "Then that is Ned," says she. "No, it ain't," says that, and twirled its tail faster. "Well," says she, a bit more thoughtful, "that is Mark." "No, it ain't," says that, and laughs and laughs and laughs, and twirls its tail so as you couldn't see it, as away it flew. Well, when the king, her husband, came in, he was fine and pleased to see the 5 skeins all ready for him, for he was fond of his pretty wife. "I shall not have to order your head off, my dear," says he, "and I hope all the other days will pass as happily." Then he said good night, and locked the door and left her. But next morning they brought her fresh flax, and even more delicious foods, and the small little black thing came knocking at the window, and stuck out its beautiful toes, and twirled its tail faster and faster, and took away the bundle of flax, and brought it back all spun into 5 skeins every evening. Then that made her guess 3 times what That's name was, but she could not guess right, and that laughed and laughed and laughed as it flew away. Now every morning and evening the same thing happened, and every evening she had her 3 guesses, but she never guessed right. And every day the small little black thing laughed louder and louder, and smirked more and more, and looked at her quite maliceful out of the corners of its eyes, until she began to get frightened, and instead of eating all the fine foods left for her, spent the day in trying to think of names to say, but she never hit upon the right one. So it came to the last day of the month but one, and when the small little black thing arrived in the evening, with 5 skeins of flax already spun, it could hardly say for smirking, "Ain't you got That's name yet?" So says she, for she had been reading her Bible. "Is that Nicodemus?" "No, it ain't," says that, and twirled its tail faster than you could see. "Is that Samuel?" says she, all of a flutter. "No, it ain't, my beauty," chuckles that, looking maliceful. "Well, is that Methuselah?" says she, inclined to cry. Then that just fixes her with eyes like a coal of fire, and says, "No, it ain't that neither, so there is only tomorrow night, and then you'll be mine, my beauty." And away the small little black thing flew, its tail twirling and whisking so fast that you couldn't see it. Well, she felt so bad she couldn't even cry, but she heard the king, her husband, coming to the door, so she made bold to be cheerful, and tried to smile when he said, "Well done, wife, 5 skeins again. I shall not have to order your head off after all, my dear, of that I'm quite sure, so let us enjoy ourselves." Then he bade the servants bring supper, and a stool for him to sit beside his queen, and down they sate lover-like, side by side. But the poor queen could eat nothing. She could not forget the small little black thing, and the king hadn't eaten but a mouthful or 2 when he began to laugh, and he laughed so long and so loud that at last the poor queen, all lackadaisical as she was, said, "Why do you laugh so?" "At something I saw today, my love," says the king. "I was out a-hunting, and by chance I came to a place I'd never been in before. It was in a wood, and there was an old chalk pit there, and out of the chalk pit there came a queer kind of a sort of humming-bumming noise. So I got off my hobby to see what made it, and went quite quiet to the edge of the pit and looked down. And what do you think I saw? The funniest, queerest, smallest little black thing you ever set eyes upon. And it had a little spinning wheel, and it was spinning away for dear life, but the wheel didn't go so fast as its tail, and that span round and round, ha ha, you never saw the like. And its little feet had buckled shoes and bows on them, and they went up and down in a desperate hurry, and all the time that small little black thing kept bumming and booming away at these words, 'Name me not, who'll guess it's Tom Tit-Tot?' Well, when she heard these words, the queen nearly jumped out of her skin for joy, but she managed to say nothing, but ate her supper quite comfortably. And she said no word when next morning the small little black thing came for the flax, though it looked so gleeful and maliceful that she could hardly help laughing, knowing she had got the better of it. And when night came and she heard the knocking against the window panes, she put on a wry face and opened the window slowly as if she was afraid. But that thing was as bold as brass, and came right inside, grinning from ear to ear. And oh my goodness, how That's tail was twirling and whisking. "Well, my beauty," says That, giving her the 5 skeins already spun, "what's my name?" Then she put down her lip, and says tearful-like, Is that Solomon?" "No, it ain't," laughs That, smirking out of the corner of That's eye. And the small little black thing came further into the room. So she tried again, and this time she seemed hardly able to speak for fright. "Well, is that Zebedee?" she says. "No, it ain't," cried the impet, full of glee. And it came quite close and stretched out its little black hands to her, and oh, its tail. "Take time, my beauty," says That, sort of jeering like, and its small little black eyes seemed to eat her up. "Take time. Remember, next guess, and you're mine." Well, she backed just a wee bit from it, for it was just horrible to look at. But then she laughed out and pointed her finger at it and said, says she, name me not. Your name is Tom Tit Tot." And you never heard such a shriek as that small little black thing gave out. Its tail drooped down straight, its feet all crumpled up, and away That flew into the dark, and she never saw it no more. And she lived happy ever after with her husband, the king. End of Tom Tit Tot. Recording by Amy McCracken. Chapter 4 of English Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy McCracken. English Fairy Tales by Flora Annie Steele. The Golden Snuff Box. Once upon a time, and a very good time too, though it was not in my time, nor your time, nor for the matter of that in anyone's time, there lived a man and a woman who had one son called Jack, and he was just terribly fond of reading books. He read, and then because his parents lived in a lonely house in a lonely forest, and he never saw any other folk but his father and his mother, he became quite crazy to go out into the world and see charming princesses and the like. So one day he told his mother he must be off, and she called him an air-brained addlepate, but added that, as he was no use at home, he had better go seek his fortune. Then she asked him if he would rather take a small cake with her blessing to eat on his journey, or a large cake with her curse. Now Jack was a very hungry lad, so he just up and said, "A big cake, if you please 'em." So his mother made a great big cake, and when he started, she just off to the top of the house and cast malisons on him, till he got out of sight. You see, she had to do it, but after that she sate down and cried. Well, Jack hadn't gone far till he came to a field where his father was plowing. Now the good man was dreadfully put out when he found his son was going away, and still more so when he heard he had chosen his mother's malison. So he cast about what to do to put things straight, and at last he drew out of his pocket a little golden snuff box, and gave it to the lad, saying, "If ever you are in danger of sudden death, you may open the box, but not till then. It has been in our family for years and years, but as we have lived father and son quietly in the forest, none of us have ever been in need of help. Perhaps you may." So Jack pocketed the golden snuff box and went on his way. Now after a time he grew very tired and very hungry, for he had eaten his big cake first thing, and night closed in on him so he could scarce see his way. But at last he came to a large house and begged board and lodging at the back door. Now Jack was a good-looking young fellow, so the maid-servant at once called him into the fireside and gave him plenty good meat and bread and beer. And so it happened that while he was eating his supper, the master's gay young daughter came into the kitchen and saw him. So she went to her father and said that there was the prettiest young fellow she had ever seen in the back kitchen, and that if her father loved her, he would give the young man some employment. Now the gentleman of the house was exceedingly fond of his gay young daughter, and did not want to vex her, so he went to the back kitchen and questioned Jack as to what he could do. "Anything," said Jack gaily, meaning, of course, that he could do any foolish bit of work about a house. But the gentleman saw a way of pleasing his young gay daughter and getting rid of the trouble of employing Jack. So he laughs and says, "If you can do anything, my good lad," says he, "you had better do this. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, you must have dug a lake 4 miles round in front of my mansion, and on it there must be floating a whole fleet of vessels, and they must range up in front of my mansion and fire a salute of guns. and the very last shot must break the leg of the four-post bed on which my daughter sleeps, for she is always late of a morning." Well, Jack was terribly flabbergasted, but he faltered out, "And if I don't do it?" "Then," said the master of the house quite calmly, "your life will be the forfeit." So he bade the servants take Jack to a turret room and lock the door on him. Well, Jack stayed on the side of his bed and tried to think things out, but he felt as if he didn't know B from a battledore, so he decided to think no more, and after saying his prayers he lay down and went to sleep. And he did sleep. When he woke it was close on 8 o'clock, and he had only time to fly to the window and look out, when the great clock on the tower began to whir before it struck the hour. And there was the lawn in front of the house all set with beds of roses and stocks and marigolds. Well, all of a sudden he remembered the little golden snuff-box. "I'm near enough to death," quoth he to himself as he drew it out and opened it. No sooner had he opened it than out hopped 3 funny little red men in red nightcaps, rubbing their eyes and yawning, for you see they had been locked up in the box for years and years and years. "What do you want, master?" they said between their yawns. But Jack heard that clock a-whirring and knew he hadn't a moment to lose, so he just gabbed off his orders. Then the clock began to strike, and the little men flew out of the window, and suddenly bang, 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 bang went the guns, and the last one must have broken the leg of the four-post bed, for there at the window was the gay young daughter in her nightcap, gazing with astonishment at the lake 4 miles round, with the fleet of vessels floating on it. And so did Jack. He had never seen such a sight in his life, and he was quite sorry when the 3 little red men disturbed him by flying in at the window and scrambling into the golden snuff-box. "Give us a little more time when you want us next, master," they said sulkily. Then they shut down the lid, and Jack could hear them yawning inside as they settled down to sleep. As you may imagine, the master of the house was fair astonished, while as for the gay young daughter, she declared at once that she would never marry anyone else but the young man who could do such wonderful things, the truth being that she and Jack had fallen in love with each other at first sight. But her father was cautious. "It is true, my dear," says he, "that the young fellow seems a bully boy, but for aught we know it may be chance, not skill, and he may have broken a feather in his wing, so we must try him again." Then she said to Jack, "My daughter must have a fine house to live in. Therefore, by tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, there must be a magnificent castle standing on 12 golden pillars in the middle of the lake, and there must be a church beside it, and all things must be ready for the bride. And at 8 o'clock precisely a peal of bells from the church must ring out for the wedding. If not, you will have to forfeit your life." This time Jack intended to give the 3 little red men more time for their task, but what with having enjoyed himself so much all day, and having eaten so much good food, he overslept himself, so that the big clock on the tower was whirring before it struck 8 when he woke, leapt out of bed, and rushed to the golden snuff-box. But he had forgotten where he put it, and so the clock had really begun to strike when he found it under his pillow, opened it, and gabbled out his orders. And then you never saw how the 3 little red men tumbled over each other and yawned and stretched and made haste all at one time, so that Jack thought his life would surely be forfeit. But just as the clock struck its last chime, out rang a peal of merry bells, and there was the castle standing on 12 golden pillars, and a church beside it in the middle of the lake. And the castle was all decorated for the wedding, and there were crowds and crowds of servants and retainers, all dressed in their Sunday best. Never had Jack seen such a sight before, neither had the gay young daughter, who of course was looking out of the next window in her nightcap. And she looked so pretty and so gay that Jack felt quite cross when he had to step back to let the 3 little red men fly to their golden snuff-box. But they were far crosser than he was, and mumbled and grumbled at the hustle, so that Jack was quite glad when they shut the box down and began to snore. Well, of course, Jack and the gay young daughter were married, and were as happy as the day is long. And Jack had fine clothes to wear, fine food to eat, fine servants to wait on him, and as many fine friends as he liked. So he was in luck, but he had yet to learn that a mother's malison is sure to bring misfortune some time or another. Thus it happened that one day, when he was going a-hunting with all the ladies and gentlemen, Jack forgot to change the golden snuff-box, which he always carried about with him for fear of accidents, from his waistcoat pocket to that of his scarlet hunting coat. So he left it behind. And what should happen but that the servant let it fall on the ground when he was folding up the clothes, and the snuff box flew open, and out popped the 3 little red men, yawning and stretching. Well, when they found out that they hadn't really been summoned, and that there was no fear of death, they were in a towering temper, and said they had a great mind to fly away with the castle, golden pillars and all. On hearing this, the servant pricked up his ears. "Could you do that?" he asked. "Could we?" they said, and they laughed aloud. "Why, we can do anything." Then the servant said, ever so sharp, "Then move me this castle and all it contains right away over the sea where the master can't disturb us." Now the little red men need not really have obeyed the order, but they were so cross with Jack that hardly had the servant said the words before the task was done. So when the hunting party came back, lo and behold, the castle and the church and the golden pillars had all disappeared. At first all the rest set upon Jack for being a knave and a cheat, and in particular his wife's father threatened to have at him for deceiving the young gay daughter. But at last he agreed to let Jack have 12 months and a day to find the castle and bring it back. So off Jack starts on a good horse with some money in his pocket. And he traveled far and he traveled fast, and he traveled east and west, north and south, over hills and dales, and valleys and mountains, and woods and sheepwalks, but never a sign of the missing castle did he see. Now at last he came to the palace of the king of all the mice in the wide world. And there was a little mousie in a fine hauberk and a steel cap doing sentry at the front gate. And he was not for letting Jack in until he told his errand. And when Jack had told it, he passed him on to the next mouse sentry at the inner gate. So by degrees he reached the king's chamber, where he sate surrounded by mice courtiers. Now the king of the mice received Jack very graciously, and said that he himself knew nothing of the missing castle. But as he was king of all the mice in the whole world, it was possible that some of his subjects might know more than he. So he ordered his chamberlain to command a grand assembly for the next morning, and in the meantime he entertained Jack right royally. But the next morning, though there were brown mice and black mice, and gray mice and white mice and piebald mice, from all parts of the world, they all answered with one breath, "If it please your majesty, we have not seen the missing castle." Then the king said, "You must go and ask my elder brother, the king of all the frogs. He may be able to tell you. Leave your horse here and take one of mine. It knows the way and will carry you safe." So Jack set off on the king's horse, and as he passed the outer gate, he saw the little mouse sentry coming away, for its guard was up. Now Jack was a kind-hearted lad, and he had saved some crumbs for his dinner in order to recompense the little sentry for his kindness. So he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out the crumbs. "Here you are, Mousekin," he said. "That's for your trouble." Then the mouse thanked him kindly, and asked if he would take him along to the king of the frogs. "Not I," says Jack. "I should get into trouble with your king." But the mousekin insisted. "I may be of some use to you," it said. So it ran at the horse's hind leg, and up by its tail and hid in Jack's pocket. And the horse set off at a hand gallop, for it didn't half like the mouse running over it. So at last Jack came to the palace of the king of all the frogs, and there at the front gate was a frog doing sentry in a fine coat of mail and a brass helmet. And the frog sentry was for not letting Jack in, but the mouse called out that they came from the king of all the mice, and must be let in without delay. So they were taken to the king's chamber, where he sate surrounded by frog courtiers in fine clothes. But alas, he had heard nothing of the castle on golden pillars, and though he summoned all the frogs of all the world to a grand assembly next morning, they all answered his question with crow, 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 which everyone knows stands for no in frog language. So the king said to Jack, "There remains but one thing. You must go and ask my elder brother, the king of all the birds. His subjects are always on the wing, so mayhap they have seen something. Leave the horse you are riding here and take one of mine. It knows the way and will carry you safe." So Jack set off, and being a kind-hearted lad, he gave the frog sentry, whom he met coming away from his guard, some crumbs he had saved from his dinner. And the frog asked leave to go with him, and when Jack refused to take him, he just gave one hop onto the stirrup, and a second hop onto the crupper, and the next hop he was in Jack's other pocket. Then the horse galloped away like lightning, for it didn't like the slimy frog coming down plop on its back. Well, after a time, Jack came to the palace of the king of all the birds. And there at the front gate were a sparrow and a crow marching up and down with matchlocks on their shoulders. Now at this Jack laughed fit to split, and the mouse and the frog from his pockets called out, "We come from the king! Sirrahs, let us pass!" So that the sentries were right mazed, and let them pass, and without more ado. But when they came to the king's chamber, where he sat surrounded by all manner of birds, tomtits, wrens, cormorants, turtle doves, and the like, the king said he was sorry, but he had no news of the missing castle. And though he summoned all the birds of all the world to a grand assembly next morning, not one of them had seen or heard tell of it. So Jack was quite disconsolate till the king said, "But where is the eagle? I don't see my eagle." Then the chamberlain, he was a tomtit, stepped forward with a bow and said, "May it please your majesty, he is late." "Late," says the king in a fume. "Summon him at once." So 2 larks flew up into the sky till they couldn't be seen, and sang ever so loud, till at last the eagle appeared all in a perspiration from having flown so fast. Then the king said, "Sirrah, have you seen the missing castle that stands upon 12 pillars of gold?" And the eagle blinked its eyes and said, "May it please your majesty, that is where I've been." Then everybody rejoiced exceedingly, and when the eagle had eaten a whole calf so as to be strong enough for the journey, he spread his wide wings, on which Jack stood, with the mouse in one pocket and the frog in the other, and started to obey the king's order to take the owner back to his missing castle as quickly as possible. And they flew over land and they flew over sea, until at last in the far distance they saw the castle standing on its 12 golden pillars. But all the doors and windows were fast shut and barred, for see you, the servant master who had run away with it had gone out for the day a-hunting, and he always bolted doors and windows while he was absent, lest someone else should run away with it. Then Jack was puzzled to think how he should get hold of the golden snuff-box, until the little mouse said, "Let me fetch it. There is always a mouse-hole in every castle, so I am sure I shall be able to get in." So it went off, and Jack waited on the eagle's wings in a fume, till at last Mouseskin appeared. "Have you got it?" shouted Jack, and the little mousie cried, "Yes!" So everyone rejoiced exceedingly, and they set off back to the palace of the king of all the birds, where Jack had left his horse. For now that he had the golden snuff-box safe, he knew he could get the castle back whenever he chose to send the 3 little red men to fetch it. But on the way over the sea, while Jack, who was dead tired with standing so long, lay down between the eagle's wings and fell asleep, the mouse and the eagle fell to quarreling as to which of them had helped Jack the most, and they quarreled so much that at last they laid the case before the frog. Then the frog, who made a very wise judge, said he must see the whole affair from the very beginning. So the mouse brought out the golden snuff-box from Jack's pocket and began to relate where it had been found and all about it. Now at that very moment Jack awoke, kicked out his leg, and plump went the golden snuff-box down to the very bottom of the sea. "I thought my turn would come," said the frog, and went plump in after it. Well, they waited and waited and waited for 3 whole days and 3 whole nights. But Froggy never came up again, and they had just given him up in despair when his nose showed above the water. "Have you got it?" they shouted. "No," says he with a great gasp. "Then what do they want?" they cried in a rage. "My breath," says Froggy, and with that he sinks down again. Well, they waited 2 days and 2 nights more, and at last up comes the little frog with the golden snuff-box in its mouth. Then they all rejoiced exceedingly, and the eagle flew ever so fast to the palace of the king of the birds. But alas and alack-a-day, Jack's troubles were not ended. His mother's malison was still bringing him ill luck, for the king of the birds flew into a fearsome rage because Jack had not brought the castle of the golden pillars back with him. And he said that unless he saw it by 8 o'clock next morning, Jack's head should come off as a cheat and a liar. Then Jack, being close to death, opened the golden snuff-box, and out tumbled the 3 little red men in their 3 little red caps. They had recovered their tempers, and were quite glad to be back with a master who knew that they would only, as a rule, work under fear of death. For see you, the servant master had been forever disturbing their sleep with opening the box for no purpose. So before the clock struck 8 next morning, there was the palace on its 12 golden pillars, and the king of the birds was fine and pleased, and let Jack take his horse and ride to the palace of the King of the Frogs. But there exactly the same thing happened, and poor Jack had to open the snuff box again and order the castle to come to the palace of the King of the Frogs. At this the little red men were a bit cross, but they said they supposed it could not be helped. So though they yawned, they brought the castle all right, and Jack was allowed to take his horse and go to the palace of the king of all the mice in the world. But here the same thing happened, and the little red men tumbled out of the golden snuff box in a real rage, and said fellows might as well have no sleep at all. However, they did as they were bidden. They brought the castle of the golden pillars from the palace of the King of the Frogs to the palace of the King of the Birds, and Jack was allowed to take his own horse and ride home. So before the clock struck 8 next morning, there was the palace on its 12 golden pillars, and the King of the Birds was fine and pleased, and let Jack take his horse and ride to the palace of the King of the Frogs. But there exactly the same thing happened, and poor Jack had to open the snuff box again and order the castle to come to the palace of the King of the Frogs. At this the little red men were a bit cross, but they said they supposed it could not be helped. So though they yawned, they brought the castle all right, and Jack was allowed to take his horse and go to the palace of the king of all the mice in the world. But here the same thing happened, and the little red men tumbled out of the golden snuff box in a real rage, and said fellows might as well have no sleep at all. However, they did as they were bidden. They brought the castle of the golden pillars from the palace of the King of the Frogs to the palace of the king of all the mice in the world, and Jack was allowed to take his own horse and ride home. But the year and a day which he had been allowed was almost gone, and even his gay young wife, after almost weeping her eyes out after her handsome young husband, had given up Jack for lost. So everyone was astounded to see him, and not overpleased either to see him come without this castle. Indeed, his father-in-law swore with many oaths that if it were not in its proper place by 8 o'clock next morning, Jack's life should be forfeit. Now this, of course, was exactly what Jack had wanted and intended from the beginning, because when death was nigh, he could open the golden snuff box and order about the little red men. But he had opened it so often of late, and they had become so cross, that he was in a stew what to do, whether to give them time to show their temper, or to hustle them out of it. At last he decided to do half and half. So just as the hands of the clock were at 5 minutes to 8, he opened the box and stopped his ears. Well, you never heard such a yawning and scolding and threatening and blustering. What did he mean by it? Why should he take 4 bites at one cherry? If he was always in fear of death, why didn't he die and have done with it? In the midst of all this, the tower clock began to whir. "Gentlemen," says Jack. He was really quaking with fear. "Do as you are told." "For the last time," they shrieked. "We won't stay and serve a master who thinks he is going to die every day." And with that they flew out of the window, and they never came back. The gold snuff box remained empty forevermore. But when Jack looked out of the window, there was the castle in the middle of the lake on its 12 golden pillars. And there was his young wife, ever so pretty and gay in her nightcap, looking out of the window too. So they lived happily ever after. End of The Golden Snuff Box. Recording by Amy McCracken.
Chapter 5 of English Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. English Fairy Tales by Flora Annie Steele. Tattercoats. In a great palace by the sea, there once dwelt a very rich old lord, who had neither wife nor children living, only one little granddaughter, whose face he had never seen in all her life. He hated her bitterly, because at her birth his favorite daughter died, and when the old nurse brought him the baby, he swore that it might live or die as it liked, but he would never look on its face as long as it lived. So he turned his back and sat by his window, looking out over the sea and weeping great tears for his lost daughter, till his white hair and beard grew down over his shoulders and twined round his chair and crept into the chinks of the floor, and his tears, dropping onto the window ledge, wore a channel through the stone and ran away in a little river to the great sea. Meanwhile, His granddaughter grew up with no one to care for her or clothe her. Only the old nurse, when no one was by, would sometimes give her a dish of scraps from the kitchen or a torn petticoat from the rag bag, while the other servants of the palace would drive her from the house with blows and mocking words, calling her tattercoats and pointing to her bare feet and shoulders till she ran away crying to hide among the bushes. So she grew up with little to eat or to wear, spending her days out of doors, her only companion a crippled gooseherd who fed his flock of geese on the common. And this gooseherd was a queer, merry little chap, and when she was hungry or cold or tired, he would play to her so gaily on his little pipe that she forgot all her troubles and would fall to dancing with his flock of noisy geese for partners. Now one day people told each other that the king was traveling through the land and was to give a great ball to all the lords and ladies of the country in the town nearby, and that the prince, his only son, was to choose a wife from amongst the maidens in the company. In due time, one of the royal invitations to the ball was brought to the palace by the sea, and the servants carried it up to the old lord, who still sat by his window, wrapped in his long white hair and weeping into the little river that was fed by his tears. But when he heard the king's command, he dried his eyes and bade them bring shears to cut him loose, for his hair had bound him a fast prisoner, and he could not move. And then he sent them for rich clothes and jewels, which he put on, and he ordered them to saddle the white horse with gold and silk, that he might ride to meet the king. But he quite forgot he had a granddaughter to take to the ball. Meanwhile, Tattercoats sat by the kitchen door weeping, because she could not go to see the grand doings. And when the old nurse heard her crying, she went to the lord of the palace and begged him to take his granddaughter with him to the king's ball. But he only frowned and told her to be silent, while the servants laughed and said, "Tattercoats is happy in her rags, playing with the gooseherd. Let her be. It is all she is fit for." A second and a third time the old nurse begged him to let the girl go with him, but she was answered only by black looks and fierce words, till she was driven from the room by the jeering servants with blows and mocking words. Weeping over her ill success, the old nurse went to look for Tattercoats, but the girl had been turned from the door by the cook and had run away to tell her friend the gooseherd how unhappy she was because she could not go to the king's ball. Now when the gooseherd had listened to her story, he bade her cheer up and proposed that they should go together into the town to see the king and all the fine things. And when she looked sorrowfully down at her rags and bare feet, he played a note or two upon his pipe, so gay and merry that she forgot all about her tears and her troubles, and before she well knew, the gooseherd had taken her by the hand, and she and he and the geese before them were dancing down the road towards the town. "Even cripples can dance when they choose," said the gooseherd. Before they had gone very far, a handsome young man, splendidly dressed, riding up, stopped to ask the way to the castle where the king was staying, and when he found that they too were going thither, he got off his horse and walked beside them along the road. "You seem merry folk," he said, "and will be good company." "Good company indeed," said the gooseherd, and played a new tune that was not a dance. It was a curious tune, and it made the strange young man stare and stare and stare at Tattercoats till he couldn't see her rags, till he couldn't, to tell the truth, see anything but her beautiful face. Then he said, "You are the most beautiful maiden in the world. Will you marry me?" Then the gooseherd smiled to himself and played sweeter than ever. But Tattercoats laughed. "Not I," said she. "You would be finely put to shame, and so would I be, if you took a goose girl for your wife. Go and ask one of the great ladies you will see tonight at the king's ball, and do not flout poor Tattercoats." But the more she refused him, the sweeter the pipe played, and the deeper the young man fell in love, till at last he begged her to come that night at 12 to the king's ball, just as she was, with the gooseherd and his geese, in her torn petticoat and bare feet, and see if he wouldn't dance with her before the king and the lords and ladies, and present her to them all. as his dear and honored bride. Now at first Tattercoats said she would not, but the gooseherd said, "Take fortune when it comes, little one." So when night came, and the hall in the castle was full of light and music, and the lords and ladies were dancing before the king, just as the clock struck 12, Tattercoats and the gooseherd, followed by his flock of noisy geese, hissing and swaying their heads, entered at the great doors and walked straight up the ballroom, while on either side the ladies whispered, the lords laughed, and the king, seated at the far end, stared in amazement. But as they came in front of the throne, Tattercoats' lover rose from beside the king and came to meet her. Taking her by the hand, he kissed her thrice before them all and turned to the king. "Father," he said, for it was the prince himself, "I have made my choice, and here is my bride, the loveliest girl in all the land, and the sweetest as well." Before he had finished speaking, the gooseherd had put his pipe to his lips and played a few notes that sounded like a bird singing far off in the woods. And as he played, Tattercoats' rags were changed to shining robes sewn with glittering jewels. A golden crown lay upon her golden hair, and the flock of geese behind her became a crowd of dainty pages bearing her long train. And as the king rose to greet her, as his daughter, the trumpets sounded loudly in honor of the new princess, and the people outside in the street said to each other, "Ah, now the prince has chosen for his wife the loveliest girl in all the land." But the gooseherd was never seen again, and no one knew what became of him, while the old lord went home once more to his palace by the sea, for he could not stay at court when he had sworn never to look on his granddaughter's face. So there he sits still by his window. If you could only see him, as you may some day, weeping more bitterly than ever, and his white hair has bound him to the stones, and the river of his tears runs away to the great sea. End of chapter 5.